When I was studying in my class 11, I learned the concept of equity and debt, and our teacher asked a simple question to all of us. What is better for a business in terms of capital, equity, or debt? For a moment, we all got confused and we thought, like, as equity shareholders, we need not pay them every year, right? It depends on the performance of the business. Whereas debt, if you see, we have to pay every year fixed interest payments irrespective of the business did well or not. So our answer was, ma'am, equity is a better option compared to debt. And like we thought that what we were thinking is right. In the end, the teacher revealed her answer, which was very different. What she told us that debt is comparatively a better option as capital for a business because the cost of capital is relatively less compared to the equity holders. Now, as we all know, there is a 12% annual return on the Indian stock market, but whenever we see in the savings account we get a relatively very less return, like 3 to 4%. So now if that is very clear, let us understand what happens if you don't manage your debt well. We know that debt is cheaper. What if you don't know how to manage your debt well? Let us understand this using the Sri Lankan case study of how there was a debt crisis and how Sri Lanka as an economy is recovering from debt. To give you an overview, Sri Lanka is a twin deficit economy, which means that it has a both physical deficit and a current account deficit. Physical deficit is nothing but the government spends more than it earns as taxes, and the government does not have money for any social or infrastructure projects. This means that the government is doing social and infrastructure projects solely with the help of debt. Current account deficit is nothing but the country's exports are relatively less compared to its imports. This means that the country does not have much foreign exchange reserves and there is no money for the country to spend. Whatever money is spent by the country is on debt. In short, this means that the citizens of the country do not have money to buy anything extra. Now the question is, even India, US and the UK are twin deficit economies, right? Then why only Sri Lanka went bankrupt? The answer is simple. These countries know how to manage their debt well. And the second reason is these countries have relatively very high income levels compared to Sri Lanka. As of 2025, Sri Lanka's economy is recovering and inflation has come down from 70% in 2022 to 3% in 2025. And the country's foreign exchange reserves has improved from 2.3 billion US dollars in 2022 to 6.8 billion US dollars in 2025. In today's times, India is already affected by the Russia-Ukraine war, US-Iran war, Trump tariffs, hyperinflation, and climate change. Let us understand from a macroeconomic perspective of Sri Lanka what are the lessons that India should be aware in order to curb inflation and stabilize its economy in order to avoid a Sri Lanka-like crisis. One of the first macroeconomic changes that the Sri Lankan government made was the devaluation of the local currency. To simplify that, if you know, there are two types of systems that a country can apply in terms of its currency valuation. The first type of the exchange rate system is the fixed exchange rate system. So if you see in the fixed exchange rate system, what happens is your currency value is artificially controlled by the government in order to stabilize your currency. So if you see an economy like Sri Lanka or India or Pakistan is not at all stable, right? If we put the currency valuation solely at the risk of the demand and supply, the currency value may go down and the economy may be affected, correct? So in this case, what happens was the government sells the US dollars and buys its own currency to create an artificial demand and stabilize its currency. The second type of the exchange rate system is the floating exchange rate system, which is adopted by developing countries around the world. So in this case, if you see, the currency value is determined solely by the demand and supply of the currency. So for example, like the US dollar or the British pound, the demand is solely on the demand and supply of the particular currency. So this is, adopted by developing countries around the world, and the currency value is solely determined by how well your economy is performing. To simplify, what you can sell to the world. This is what a floating exchange rate system means, and the currency value depends solely on this factor. How cool is this, right? Even though your currency value is going down, you can artificially manipulate it and bring back your currency value to a particular extent. But the issue with this is, in order to sell US dollar, you should have enough US dollar, right, in terms of foreign reserves. That is where Sri Lanka went into an economic crisis. As we all know, Sri Lanka has adopted a fixed exchange rate system, and the dollar value of $1 was pegged to 203 Sri Lankan rupees. So what happened was in 2022, when the Sri Lankan economy was performing poorly due to the COVID-19 outbreak and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Sri Lanka did not have enough foreign reserves to maintain its currency. I hope now you understand the case of Sri Lanka, where the pegged value was really higher and the real value of Sri Lankan rupee was not that much. As we all know, Sri Lanka has not much to offer to the world, right? Mainly they are dependent on agriculture and tourism. So in this case, what happens was, for example, what if the amount of money you spend in Sri Lanka is equivalent to the amount of money you spend in Thailand? No one will go to Sri Lanka, right? Because Thailand is a better place and has better things to offer. We all know that one friend or cousin from childhood who, goes to Sri Lanka and says Sri Lanka is very cheap. So that is one of the major factors why people go to Sri Lanka. But what if the government is very much stubborn on maintaining its currency? No one will go to Sri Lanka, right? So in this case, what happened was Sri Lanka did not have foreign reserves to stabilize its currency. So what happened was the real value of the Sri Lankan rupee started to appear in the international forex markets. That is, the currency value started going down. As a result, imports became expensive and exports became cheaper. These attracted more money into the economy, and the country's economy started to grow, and therefore the foreign reserves of the country started to grow. If that is clear, let's go on to the next point. The next macroeconomic change that the Sri Lankan government brought was increasing the tax rates. If you guys remember, the Rajapaksa government in 2019 reduced the tax rates overall and expected people to spend more in order to boost the economy. This became a disaster for Sri Lanka as people did not spend at all due to the COVID crisis, and the government's revenue fell by a huge extent. This further worsened the fiscal deficit and current account deficit of Sri Lanka. Do you guys know what happens when government revenue falls? The government does not have any money for social welfare and infrastructure projects of a country. And also, the government is no longer able to service its debt obligations, which leads to more printing of money and hyperinflation thereafter. As a result, when the Vikramasinghe government came into power in 2022, they immediately increased the tax rates overall to improve the government revenue. VAT rate was increased from 8% to 15%, corporation tax was increased from 24% to 30%, pay as you earn tax, which is a tax deductible at source for all private employees, was reintroduced. Agriculture and IT, which was previously exempt under taxes, was reintroduced for taxation, and the tax rebates were reduced by a huge extent. I hope now you understand the importance of government revenue and taxes in order for a political system to function smoothly. The next macroeconomic change that the Sri Lankan government brought was reducing the subsidies and freebies. As soon as the Vikramasinghe government came into power in 2022, they immediately increased the prices of electricity and petrol. This is because the petrol was sold to public at below market rates and the electricity was provided to the public at below cost. So the issue with this is that if the government does not have enough money to bear these losses, the government has to take debt or print in more money, which will lead to inflation and become a burden to the taxpayers for future generations. This is why we must never encourage freebie politics in a country, because in the short term, the citizens of the country are benefited, but in the long term, it becomes a disaster. To simplify this point, more freebies means more government losses, and more government losses means more debt and more taxes for future generations. The next macroeconomic change that the Sri Lankan government brought was tighten the central bank regulations. To simplify, the goal of the central bank is to stabilize the economy and maintain the currency value. In this case, what was happening was the government of Sri Lanka was not independent of the central bank of Sri Lanka. So the government can print more money to impress the public, which can lead to the currency declining in value. This can destabilize the economy and can lead to more problems. As soon as the Vikramasinghe government came into power in 2022, they separated the central bank from the government of Sri Lanka so that the money supply is in control. Also, the central bank immediately increased the interest rates to reduce the money supply in the economy and stabilize the Sri Lankan rupee. We should treat this with very much care and question the government on the printing of money for their own political agenda, which can destabilize or crash the economy of a country. As a result of the interest rate hikes by the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, the value of the Sri Lankan rupee improved and inflation reduced in the economy. This overall helped the Sri Lankan government to stabilize its economy. The next macroeconomic change that the Sri Lankan government brought was import restrictions. As you guys already know, in 2022, the government of Sri Lanka was facing major issues in importing essentials like food, medicines, gold, and oil. As a result, when the Vikramasinghe government came into power in 2022, they immediately banned the imports of non-essential and luxury goods to save on foreign exchange reserves. The next macroeconomic change that the Sri Lankan government brought was taking anti-corruption measures. The issue with corruption is that it only favors the group of rich and powerful individuals, whereas a wide number of public still have to struggle to earn their share of bread. Moreover, the money allocated to the social welfare activities of the country never reaches to the poor and needy population of the country. Not only that, because of corruption, there is always a delay in approvals and procedures by public sector organizations, which as a result discourages businesses and foreign direct investment into the economy. Now, let us understand from the Sri Lankan debt crisis what are the lessons as Indians that we should be aware in order to protect our economy. The first point is reducing our dependence on imports. As Indians, we are heavily dependent on imported goods such as gold, crude, electronics, and luxury goods. Hence, we should either reduce our consumption in these sectors or be self sufficient in these industries to improve our current account deficits. The next point is never fall for freebies. As we know from the Sri Lankan debt crisis, a wide majority of the debt was created by the freebie politics that the government was playing. Here we understand that nothing is free in this world and everything has a hidden cost. What government is providing free today would be out of debt, which will become a tax burden on future generations. The next point is earn your bread and pay your taxes. As you all know from the Sri Lankan case study, tax revenue is one of the major forms of revenue for the government. More government revenue means in a time of crisis, the government will be able to manage its people better without printing much money or taking additional debt. The classic example of this is how the government of India managed the COVID-19 crisis without taking any debt or printing in more money. The last point is question the government on unwanted infrastructure projects. In the case of Sri Lanka, projects such as the Hambantota port and the Lotus Tower were loss-making projects which pushed Sri Lanka to a debt trap to China. A classic example of this is a Statue of Unity built by the government of India at a budget of rupees 3000 crores. That's all guys from my end today. If you learned something valuable, please do not hesitate to let us know in the comment section below and I'll see you guys in my next video.